Hello, everybody. Everybody hear me okay? Okay, welcome to everybody online and everybody in person. I'm going to do something a little crazy here, and then I will get going. Oh, come on. Okay, I'll do my crazy thing later. All right. So, it's early in the morning. We should wake up a little bit. And what better way to wake up than sound effects in keynote slides? So here we go. So there I am, and today, since we're talking about AI stuff, I also brought all my little AI guys. So here they come. And all of us together are here to talk about how AI ate my website. And so when you think about that, what do you picture when you think about AI eating a website? Based on some of the conversations I heard around the conference, people might have some kind of like scary doom and gloom mindsets when they think about AI, right? Maybe there's some scary things like this giant computer brain that's out there and it's basically eating up all these web pages on its way to global dominance, right? My poor AI guys, they didn't last very long, did they? Don't worry, they'll come back. Let's get that thing out of here. Everybody awake now? Everybody awake at home? I can't tell. You might be passed out in front of your monitors, but that's okay. Okay, in truth though, when people talk about AI today, and I've heard it around a bunch of the talks that we've been here, most people's heads go to something like ChatGPT, right? This has sort of become the zeitgeist of what artificial intelligence and software is today. And so this is a large language model from OpenAI. It's been trained on the types of huge data that I mentioned earlier, and you can ask it all kinds of questions. I don't need to do bio slides anymore because you can all just go over to ChatGPT and say, who is Luke? And since my website was part of this massive training set that ChatGPT was trained on, you can get a pretty decent answer here. I don't really need an intro slide anymore. But it's not just my site that's part of this training data. It's all websites. And since these large language models are basically just predicting the next token in a sequence, they can very easily predict likely things, but incorrect things. So for example, it's really probable that a product designer like me went to a school like CMU, which ChatGPT says I did, but that's not true. And I say, hey, I think I went to school at UIU. You say, you're right, but you went to grad school at CMU, which I also did not. No problem though, but because of things like reinforcement learning, right? You can basically make these things please you. They're designed to do the best job that they can to comply. You correct them. They'll be like, okay, you're right, I'm sorry. He didn't go to CMU. And you can also make them veer off into weird spaces, but I'm not going to do that because my intro animation was weird enough for today, I think. So we'll leave it at that. But let's zoom out for a second and see this relationship between things like large language models and websites. You've got sites like mine and a whole bunch of other ones out there, right? Many, many websites, lots and lots of text on them. And effectively, what we're doing is looking at all these different pieces of text on the internet and using them to build these immense auto-completion machines is one way of thinking about it, right? And so you get all this training data, and ultimately it enables ChatGPT to say things like, who is Luke Wroblewski, in a pretty coherent way. And with this sort of framing, right, you take all the data out there, you train on it, and then you build this generated content, it's easy to see why people get into these kind of scary AI scenarios, right? If you think of training giant machine brains on the totality of published content on the internet. Yeah, that doesn't not sound scary, does it? But I think there's a different way of thinking about this. Instead of thinking about this as a monolithic AI or AGI type of brain, that's not very helpful for us to consider how can we build product experiences? How can we kind of use these technologies to the benefit of our users? And ChatGPT, again, it's the kind of prototypical example out there. Most people mentioning it. It's a AI model, but it's just one kind. It's a large language model. There's lots of different kinds of AI models out there that can be used for many different things. You can use them for language operations, like taking text and turning it into speech, or taking speech and turning it into text, translating text, synthesizing speech, classifying documents. There's some models that are specifically tuned to one of these tasks, and other ones that are more general and can do a bunch of these different tasks. There's also vision tasks, right, like face recognition, object detection, so on and so forth. So there's lots and lots of things you can use AI models for. And what's really different today as opposed to a couple years ago is now a lot of these models are very capable and very accessible. Right? On my computer right now, I have, I don't know, 10 or so of these things doing various tasks on just my little laptop. And most of them I can just download from the internet and start using, which is a very drastic change from when these things used to sort of be confined to research groups in large companies or universities. So you can start to use these AI models to rethink what's possible when people interact with our websites. And not just our websites, but software in general. And the parts that I'm most interested in here is what kind of experiences can we now deliver? Things that were really, really hard to do before. And the nice part about that is you can go from this concept of this is a scary, big AI thing to, oh, sweet, look at all these awesome new capabilities that are now in my tool belt for rethinking how people can use software. So with that in mind, I want to walk through an example with a bunch of details on how things work, why things work, when we took a bunch of those web capabilities and applied them to my little website here. So this is my site. I started 28 years ago. I know I look really young, thank you, but I'm actually pretty old as dirt, because this website's almost 30 years old. And over those 30 years, I've added a lot of content to it. 2,000 articles, 100 videos, something like 370 PDFs, presentations, lots and lots of stuff. Right? So all this content over the past 28 years has been added. And those of you familiar with the web and the internet know that you can get your way to that type of content. Usually, there's two kind of like key modalities that you can make use of. One is searching stuff, right? That's pretty common, or you can browse things. But when you do that, there's 500,000 written words, 6,000 minutes of video now, like 3,000 minutes of audio. So God bless you if you're going to ever make your way through this. It's quite a daunting task, right? So search and browse, while understood, very pervasive and accessible, there's still a lot of work to make your way through things to figure stuff out. So what if instead, in the real/virtual world like we're in right now, if you have a question for me, like how do I decide what metrics to use for my app? You could just ask me. And what I would do in the real world is I'd be like, what do I know about that? I think I know some things. Right? I'd try to remember all the stuff. I would assemble it in real time, all in my head, and then I would start blathering out a response. So the human brain, way more so than an AI brain, is a pretty amazing thing. Right? I can kind of go through this process within seconds, and when you ask me that question, I can pull from everything I know, hopefully, and give you a response. That real-world experience is very different from the digital experience with websites. Again, if you search, you can go wade through. In this case, they're not blue, but usually, your 10 blue links, right? Click, is that where? No, that wasn't it. Let me go back. Oh, okay. You know that dance, right? Or you can go, okay, here's a bunch of things, and these are all this is nice now, because these are, of the 2,000 articles, these are the 243 that are about metrics. So you're like, getting closer, right? Still, it's a bunch of work. So what if instead we can get closer to the way we do things in real life? So you ask, how do I pick metrics for my app? And I go through all the stuff that I've written, think about it, pull it together into a coherent reply, cite the sources I'm using, let you go deeper so you can get more context or verify what I said. So here, right, how do I pick metrics for my app? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you're like, I want to learn a bit more, you can go right up here. In this case, part of the response comes from a video, from a presentation that I gave, like this one in Dublin. And you could see it's referencing 1 hour, 17 minutes, and 50 seconds. So you click on that, and it takes you right to that point in the video where how do I pick my metrics is being discussed. And then you can search, scrub, find things that you want. You can even ask questions specific to that video in here, so on and so forth. So this summary, this transcript, the diarization, which shows you Luke talking and then somebody asking questions and they're talking, all of that is AI generated. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but essentially this is what happens when a bunch of these AI capabilities or these AI models, and I'm using this little metaphor here, but effectively eat all the pieces of content that make up my website and spit out like a very different interaction model, a pretty unified interaction model, which is a very interesting part of this, as we'll see a little bit later as well. Now, the first question when I talk about this stuff that people usually have is, oh, how did you build that? But let's look at the what first, and then we can get into how it gets put together. So when seeing this, I bet a bunch of you are thinking, I ask a question, you respond with an answer. Ooh, chatbot. Right? Isn't this just a chatbot? Now, chat design patterns are very, very familiar to all of us because we spend way too much time on our messaging apps. I bet half of you are chatting with somebody right now during this talk. Maybe not half. 60%? So this pattern is really common to us, right? And the layout of these apps is generally this like series of alternating messages. I say something, someone replies, on it goes, back and forth. If somebody says a lot of stuff, space for it in the UI grows. Sometimes it takes up like, almost the whole screen because they're really chatty in the chat. But you know this pattern. Perhaps unsurprisingly, though, it turns out that this type of pattern isn't necessarily optimal for these iterative conversations that you're having with sets of documents, for example, as we're dealing with here. So the Nielsen-Norman group did a bunch of usability studies for these large language model chat-based experiences, and they found a bunch of issues with this back and forth pattern, right? In particular, people need to scroll these long conversations to find and extract information. And the one quote I'll sort of pull out here is, this behavior is a significant point of friction which we observed in all study participants. So maybe the chat pattern and just slapping it onto a large language model isn't the best thing to do. And unfortunately, what happens sometimes is an engineer who's working with a large language model is like, oh, I'll put a chat thing on it. All of a sudden it blows up, and then it becomes like the default pattern everybody uses. But what was the thought process on that at the beginning? Who knows? We weren't there, right? But most people then pick it up and start using it with all its benefits and, in some cases, disadvantages. So to account for some of these disadvantages and a few other things, as we went through thinking about how to design this process, we ended up with a different interaction model, which doesn't exactly look like a chatbot thing, but looks a little bit more like this. And so let me zoom in on that for half a second. So in this approach, all the previous question and answer pairs, because they can run long, have a lot of information, kind of get collapsed, but you can still see the question and a bit of the answer, so you can quickly scan to find things. No more scrolling these massive walls of text. And then each question and answer pair you can expand to see the full result. And you can pull stuff out, pin them, what have you. So visually, it looks like this. Right, here's a large screen version of this. Again, at the top are these collapsed previous question and answer pairs, and then the current one is wide open. But you can go to any previous one and pop it open and read what's in there. So you can scan it, find what you need to expand as well. And net, if you kind of think about what design pattern does this look like, it actually looks a little bit more like an FAQ site than a chat interface at the end of the day, right? Like a FAQ site's kind of got the search thing, and then they've usually got a bunch of questions collapsed that you can expand, so you can quickly find the question you're looking for an answer to and then open it up. And I'm not saying FAQ pattern is the perfect thing here either, but it's a very different end state than the chat pattern. And I think this is a really nice example of how starting with the problem space instead of the solution is very useful. Because what we see all the time, over and over again, is people start the design process with something like a competitive audit, right? Let's look at what all the other companies are doing, put it up on a wall, and then think about what our design solution should be. And so the metaphor I always use for this, if you've ever ridden a bike, you're on a bike, right? If you're looking at a tree, where are you going to go? You're going to steer right into that tree. Same thing is true for motorcycles, race cars, right? So what is the advice when you're on a bike? You look where you want to go. And the same thing is true when you're designing. You kind of want to be looking where you want to go and not looking at the competition, because what you're going to do is you're going to end up smack dab copying what they're doing. So instead of starting with solutions, it's much better to let the problem space guide the solution, right? Understand the problem and then gradually build it up. And you may end up with something that looks like a chatbot, but then you have a lot of confidence that that's the right answer because you took that process to get there. Or you may end up with something that looks a little bit more like an FAQ. So anyway, now we have this expandable conversational interface that collapses and expands so you can find answers and make your way through the stuff that you're creating easier. And it looks something like this. Why do so many designs look the same? I guess this is sort of what we were just talking about. But I left something out of this screenshot, and that is suggested questions. For the purpose of this presentation, I just sort of simplified the UI a bit in the past few examples, but the real thing has all of these suggested questions that show up inside the interface. The first few of these are related to the question you just asked. So why do so many designs look the same? The first couple of questions get built as kind of follow-ons or additional areas to explore, and then the rest come from the broader corpus of content. And these turn out to be really critical because they address this issue of what should I ask. In all of these conversational interfaces, the goal everybody has is, well, if we can answer every possible question, then we don't need to tell people what they should ask, right? And every single time a new technology comes up, well, this is it. Now we can answer every single question. But even now, with the vastness of these large language models, it still helps to guide people towards what they can ask about, what kind of successful outcomes would look like, so on and so forth. And I have confidence in that because a huge number of the questions people ask in this interface actually come from suggested questions. They're like a really nice starting point, getting you to understand what kinds of things you could find here and what sort of experience you're going to have. So we sort of knew that these were important from the beginning, but just to open up the back door a little bit and show you how we experimented with this. At first, the idea was, well, when people don't know what to ask, they'll tell us. And they'll kind of, so see this little light bulb icon down there, right? Need an idea? You click on that. It's like, oh, here's a big thing that actually gives you one of these whole conversational units on what should you ask. And then it wasn't really, typical, right? What's the light bulb icon? I don't know what that is. You've gone through this dance a million times, right? So then let's make it more clear. Now we put a what else can I ask icon. Well, that's more clear, and it works kind of the same way. But in both cases, the burden is on people to take this action to figure out what to ask. So then in subsequent interactions, we just started putting suggested questions directly after each answer automatically. You can see here's kind of one version of that. Here's another version of that. But the problem with this was we fell into another of these common UI traps where we're like, everything we add, we kind of make a little different, right? So you design it. And then people are like, oh, I can just ignore that. That looks like crap. It doesn't look like the answer. So net-net, what we ended up doing is actually putting suggested questions directly in line in these answers. So the answer comes, and then the suggested questions just follow right after it. They look exactly like the copy that is coming from the answer. So it feels like one part of a flow. And what does it mean to divert the train? This is basically this principle in action, right? Like, don't try to shift people away from their primary task or activity. Fold into it, right? Don't try to make that moving train veer off the tracks. Just kind of get in the right place at the right time. And usually that means things that feel a lot more like the primary interaction as opposed to visually or interactionally. I'll go with it. Visually or interactionally different. Okay. Now, I also mentioned that these answers come from finding relevant parts of documents, sticking them together, and then citing those responses. You can see one of these citations here up at the top. There's an article there called "Don't Divert the Train." Right? And not only these citations, but they actually serve as entry points into what I call these object-specific experiences. Now, what the hell does that mean? If you click on one of those, in many other interfaces, what happens if you click on a citation, it'll like open up another window or and take you off to some other experience, right? And then you've got to orient yourself, like, what am I looking at here? So what we tried to do here is actually create a unified way of exploring each of these citations that also gives you a bunch of common capabilities. So if you open up one of those things, you can actually expand it inline, you can interact with it, and then you can do a bunch of stuff. And this is also an interesting pattern that I think we're starting to see emerge, which is how do we bring interactions into these conversations with large language models? There's been a bunch of like little mini interactions inside of chat interfaces for a long time, right? But as more and more companies try to build these kinds of experiences, I think it's going to be something that keeps coming up. Like, how do things actually integrate as opposed to sending you off to other parts of UIs and things. So let's see what this looks like in the case of an article, right? There's how does free shipping help? You can click that little article. It opens inline. You can actually read that article. There's a summary, a bunch of topics, and you can ask questions scoped just to that article now that you found it. And there's more document types, obviously, than web pages. In my little website, there's videos, there's podcasts, there's PDFs, there's images. And so taking all of these into account and thinking about how to fold them all together into this unified interface was part of the process. So there's two steps to that. I'll kind of talk about the first one, which is, again, getting a little bit into how does this work. And that's the process of using all these AI models to break things down into a way that we can then reassemble them into that Q&A style interface we saw a second ago. So videos, let's start there. So you've got a bunch of these video files. We want to turn the audio in these video files into written text. And I mentioned that there's these different AI models that you can use for different tasks. So for that, we're going to use a text-to-speech model. Then we want to break that down into speakers. We want to use a diarization model that identifies speakers and maps them to timestamps. Then we can use either a large language model or a specific little fine-tuned model to make a summary, to extract keyword topics, to generate a list of suggested questions that these videos can answer. And we can also do things like object detection and facial recognition. Originally, we were doing a bunch of these things when we were processing these videos, but they're like all videos of me. So it was perhaps the least interesting bit of data possible, right? Guy in green shirt on stage, okay. Doesn't help. However, there are places where you might want to actually do something custom. So one of the things that we did where we basically fine-tuned one of these models was this concept of keyframe selection, which I'll walk through in a second. There's also a processing step, but I'll talk about that in the next slide. So for the keyframe selection, right, we want to show the video, and we want to have a little thumbnail of it. How do we pick a good thumbnail? Well, there's several hundred of these videos, and doing this manually would be a real pain in the butt. So what we did instead is we basically just generated automatically a bunch of keyframes, and then I manually picked a couple good examples where I was trying to find, shows the speaker pretty well, eyes are open, no stupid grin, right? And then we just fine-tuned a model with those good results, so it goes and picks the thumbnails for us. Now, here's an example where we got a bunch of different thumbnails automatically created, and you can see that the AI model nailed it by picking the thumbnail with "Which Paris girl are you?" in the background. There's a little bit of a dumb grin there, but hey, it's, given the choices, I think it did a pretty decent job picking this up. So this is just a quick little example, but I think it's also an important point to make, is you can really think about having these models do a lot of things for you, right? If you can sort of model the behavior for the model, then you can get a machine to do it for you at scale. And there's lots of things that you can pick up and turn into these processes which make things that were previously very tedious quite quick and easy. So that's how we got to thumbnails. Now, in addition to video files, we also have audio, podcasts, interviews, a lot of similar tasks in terms of processing audio files. Got to turn it into speech, want to diarize it, want to summarize it, all those fun things. But in this case, I want to talk a little bit more about the processing step. So in the processing step, there's a lot of cleanup work here because you want to basically make sure that the content you have is as good as possible when you then go ask another AI model to summarize it or do whatever you want with it. So you want to clean it up as much as possible. And what do I mean by that? Well, we want proper nouns to align. Luke is Luke. We want to use the metadata we have about the files, the date, the type, the location. We want to break it down in a way that creates meaningful pieces of that content so it can later be assembled correctly. When I talk about PDFs, you'll see what happens when you don't do this process very well and the negative impact it can have on stuff. So web pages, same thing, right? Summarize them, break them down, process them, all that good stuff. So now we have all these cleaned up little bits of content. We've taken all the videos, all the audio files, all the web pages, all the PDFs. We've broken them down into the same kind of unit. And this is really important to have that same kind of unit because when you have that same kind of unit, you can reassemble it in all sorts of different ways, as opposed to having, here's a video, here's a web page, right? Everything is now similar. And so you can take all those similar pieces of content and basically ignore the weird diagram here. Effectively, what we're doing is putting related bits of information together in what they refer to as a multi-dimensional vector space. It's hard to wrap your head around that, but the best way I've found to understand this is like, things that are about mobile touch, they sort of end up close-ish together. Things that are about e-commerce-ish, they kind of end up closer together. So you could do more fuzzy searching, right? This is an information retrieval task using AI models to find things which are similar in concept that you can then bring back and reassemble. Okay, one last thing about how it works, and this one's a system diagram, sorry, but I think it's helpful to see this piece. So you got all these docs, right? Videos, audios, web pages, what have you. We do a lot of cleanup for all of them. We put them into this index, and then this is where it gets really cool because you can have a whole bunch of different ways to get things out of that index. In fact, it's great to do it a bunch of different ways. In some cases, you can just use the user's question and see what comes back. In other cases, you can rewrite the user's question to make it broader, to make it more narrow. You can also break it down to just keywords or what have you. And so you can retrieve a bunch of different ways and get a bunch of these pieces of content back and then rank them. And the better job you do with this retrieval and ranking step, the better your responses become, right? So a lot of time spent there is useful. And then you package all that up for another large language model to then summarize it. And this is the part where things like GPT-4 come in, right? Hey, GPT-4, here's all these pieces of content. Here's what you need to do. Put it all together into an answer. But again, you can use a bunch of different models here, have a number of different answers, and then rank those and pick the best answer. The reason why there's these two iterative steps here is because machine learning works best when it's learning. Right? The whole concept is the machine learns, so you want to give the machine a lot of things to learn from. The more it can learn from, the better it's going to get. Right? So if you do, instead of just one step, right? You do like 10 different steps, and then you rank them and you learn from them. You're going to make a system that's getting better and better over time. And it's very easy to do a crappy V0, right? Like, here's a doc, summarize it for me. Oh, cool. But the more you iterate, the better you can make these systems. So what's the impact of doing all this? Because what I hear oftentimes when I show those couple slides is, man, that sounds like a lot of work. Can't you just go to like ChatGPT and ask it a question? And sure, you can. So let's ask it a question like, why do so many designs look the same? And what you get is what I would characterize as like world knowledge, right? This is like extremely broad. Well, most designs look the same because of cultural influences, legal and regulatory constraints, and functional constraints. Whereas if you ask my corpus, why do many designs look the same? I'm basically going to tell you, look, most designers are like copying what other people are doing, bro. And you also get citation and a bunch of other things, right? And so for a second here, I'll actually show you what all these citations add up on, because this is another part that excites me about this. Again, if you can systematically break down all your various content formats into meaningful, understandable chunks that are similar-ish, you can reassemble them in all kinds of different ways. You can reassemble them into whatever kind of interface you want. And you can make that interface really, really consistent if that's what you want, or really, really diverse if that's what you want. Right? But it gives you a very different slate to build from than when you have all these like totally different things. Right? I got this wacko PDF the marketing department sent me over here. I guess I put a download PDF link on my website. Somebody clicks on there like, what the F is this? So how do you bring all these things together? Well, again, citations could be audio, video, what have you. If you click on a video file, there's an inline video player. It has a transcript, little scrubber there. It's got search within the video. It auto-generates a summary, topics, lets you ask questions about what's in the video. If I click over to transcript, you can kind of see that. Audio is very, very similar, but a little different. Instead of a video player, there's an audio player, but it also has the same diarization, entity cleanup work going on there, the same kind of scrubber, the same kind of transcript. So there's a very consistent interface when you encounter an audio file versus when you encounter a video file. If you make your way to a web page, you know, content on the left, metadata on the right, ability to ask questions. By now you get the pattern, PDFs render the same way. And so all this stuff kind of happens within a single interface. And you can go in and out of documents really seamlessly, which is pretty cool. Now, PDFs, I mentioned PDFs. PDFs are special in another way, as in painfully special. You may have heard me multiple times cringe when I talk about PDFs. Well, let me explain why. So when we first built this thing, we started with web pages, right? And you were basically able to ask a question like, what is design? And it would come back and say something that I found pretty good. Design is the art of gradually applying constraints until one solution remains. And you could see it's citing a couple web pages there. So this was pretty cool. And then what we did is we added, okay, well, I got all these PDFs. Here's like 400 PDFs. Let's go through the same process, put them in our embedding index. And then, all of a sudden, the question of what is design started saying this. Design is the fundamental soul of human-made creation. I'm like, that doesn't sound like me. What the F is this? And you could see the citations changed completely to one PDF. Now what happened, this was a PDF presentation that we had done on a panel, and there was a bunch of quotes from other people answering the question, what is design? And what happens with PDFs, there's so much like markup in PDFs to make them visually look good that gets then turned into content that they start to like create a lot of noise. And you have to put in a lot of work to really clean up PDF content to get the actual content out of PDFs. And so what was happening was because there was all this layout markup, to achieve the good looks at PDFs, we ended up with lots of bad content chunks, and they basically like overwhelmed that question. So we had to do a bunch to like clean up junky stuff, and then it also gave us a reason to actually add a diversity score to the content so that we don't get weighted too much with any particular set of documents that are too similar. Right? So what we actually do now is look and see, okay, these things all look really the same. I don't care where they come from, PDFs, whatever. I'm going to only take a couple bits of them so that I diversify the responses and I'm not like flooding something with too much of one thing. So now if you ask the question, what is design? You're going to get a balance of that PDF still shows up, but now you get a video file, you get 2 podcasts, you get a text file, and more importantly, the answer gets better, which is, you know, the whole point of this whole thing, to make the answer better. Okay, so now hopefully you have a sense of what makes up this system that eats all 28 years of my content. All right, so you got all 2,000 articles, videos, PDFs, all that good stuff. And then we take all these different AI models that do these different language operations, vision operations, and more. Hence all my little AI guys hustling behind the scenes to make this happen, right? All the little AI guys go do their own little AI thing. And the result is not a big, scary brain, right? Instead, it's this new way to make use of all this content that I've published. So we can ask this designer-made AI what designers should do about AI, and that answer sounds pretty good to me. But where I think this is really exciting, and this is where I'm going to go crazy, so network here hasn't been great. I'm going to switch over to my phone, so I got some hopefully reliable internet, and I'm going to like do something a little wild because I think this is where the future of this stuff exists. So let's see. This is Twitter, X, whatever. Here's some responses I get from people. I'm going to try and find one that looks like a question. That doesn't look like a question. That doesn't look like a question. Ooh, okay, this looks like a question. So here's somebody replying to me. I'm just going to copy whatever they said there. And if the internet gods comply, and by the way, fun little, oh, you can't even see this. Oh my God, my whole demo. Okay, sorry. There, see, I told you the internet gods. Can you see me now? Okay, cool. So what I did is I went to Twitter and I found a response here that looks like a question, right? And I basically just copied that question and I pasted it into the Ask Luke interface, which, by the way, you can all try this at ask.lukew.com. And like, let's see what the answer is. It's pretty good, right? Being data informed, use data. Pretty neat. Let's try something else. Again, I'm going to be really risque here because I'm just going to put my inbox on the screen. Sorry. Okay, hold on. Bear with me. Okay, let's ignore that. Okay, this came in this morning at 7:44 a.m., all right? So this is a question, I think. This is what I saw this morning, but I didn't try this yet. So, okay, so I'm just going to copy that question out of my email and paste it in here. And this is what I was trying to show you. Like, there's a whole bunch of things to make it feel faster, but what have you. There's a possibility involve me in programs. However, specifics need to, good job. Yeah, that's pretty good. So we'll keep that person busy for a while. I tease a little bit. But why this is really interesting to me, this is like a very, very personal assistant, almost, right? Like, when I look at this, I start to have vibes of future of work in my head, in that the responses I'm getting here are built off of a lot of the stuff that I put together over the years, and I can at least get really, really close to things that I would say and respond and work from. in here. And wouldn't it be really cool if all of us had one of these little things, right, that could basically serve as our giant memory banks and do all that hard work of remembering everything you know, writing up a response from it, right, and kind of helping you along the way? Okay, so hey, that demo didn't fail completely. That's cool. Almost did, because you couldn't see anything I'm doing. But let's come back to presentation for just a minute, and then I'll wrap this up. So before you all leave thinking, I'm going to add a conversational interface to my product, which probably everybody's already thinking that anyway before I ever showed up here, let's look at a few different ways we can add some of these capabilities to interfaces. So one way is where this primary interface affordance is an input that's basically directly telling some of these AI models what to do. In the case of Ask Luke, it's telling the AI model, hey, do information retrieval tasks and summarize for me and give me an output. So you're kind of talking pretty closely to the capabilities of the model, right? Another example is like Midjourney, right? You author a prompt, it generates an image or what have you. Because there's very few UI affordances to guide people, these systems need to respond to a huge range of instructions, right? Because otherwise people get very frustrated with their mostly hidden limitations, and this is why we have things like suggested questions and all that stuff in Ask Luke. But this is one way of doing this. You can also kind of have a more quote-unquote traditional application, some UI, where the AI is more of an assistance layer. Like this is kind of the co-pilot model you see a lot, right? And here, the part that differentiates this is the interface can be changing a bunch of things on what the model is doing and how it's doing it based on what you're doing with the rest of the program, right? So you can basically like guide it and still be able to directly ask for things or interact with things. And here's another example where some inline tools can help, what have you. But it's a combination of that application-specific UI with a bit of this direct manipulation of these AI capabilities. And there's lots of different entry points here. This doesn't have to be a side panel, right? Although that's pretty common. There's overlays, modals, inline menus, what have you. But what they all have in common is that they kind of supplement this application-specific UI instead of completely replacing it, instead of acting as this primary interface. And then last but not least, there could be no UI elements for controlling the output of these AI models. Instead, they could be doing a whole bunch of things behind the scenes as you go about using an application. Right? You can be completely unaware that there's any AI stuff happening behind the scenes, like YouTube video recommendations. You don't know what's making that YouTube recommendation. You watch a video, a recommendation pops up. There could be, a grandmother in North Carolina picking it for you, or there could be a giant computer brain. You don't know. It's probably a giant computer brain, though. So I went through that kind of fast. You can dig into more details yourself. Like, go to ask.lukew.com and you can say, how do I add AI to a product design? And we'll actually cite that little article we talked about, pop open a video, what have you. So, on behalf of me and all my little AI guys, thanks. Oh, too much of that.
Hi everyone. So for the Q&A portion, we're going to be alternating questions from chat and in person, and we ask for our in-person attendees that you wait for us to give you the mic, just for accessibility and for our online folks.
So we're actually going to start with a question in the chat first. Rebecca asked, I'm curious about scaling. At what point in the size of your document set does the investment make sense?
Sorry, I'm just removing my email from here. That's a good question. The general rule on most AI things is more data is better. So the more you got, the better it'll be for things like fine-tuning existing models, like you can get away with, 50 to maybe dozens of examples to like tune something to be more like the examples you have. But if you're doing something like this with a corpus where you want it to answer from the corpus, you'll run into this challenge of there's too many things that the system can't answer, right? But what's actually interesting there, what we did for that for Ask Luke is if somebody asks a question like, why shouldn't people vote on UI options? It'll say, hey, I haven't really answered that before, or I haven't written about that. I don't have an answer. However, I have a back-end system where I can take that question and I can provide an answer, and then I can sort of give it a weighting of how much the system should use this response to that kind of answer. And so then next time somebody asks, why shouldn't people vote on UI options, there's actually a response that comes back. So that's another really interesting piece to this, is how you can actually use it to find out what people want to learn, even though you might not have an answer to it yet. So, I guess what I'm saying there is you don't have to necessarily wait until you have this perfect thing. You can be like, oh, wow, people are asking this. Let me answer it. Let me answer it. Let me answer it. And all of a sudden, woohoo, you've got a great corpus.
Do we have any in-person questions?
I'm kind of curious from, like we're involved in investor relations oriented sites. And if you've shown this to like corporate counsel or something, like where most things have to be approved as, for sure true. Like, do you foresee any difficulties with that type of situation where the answer could be taken as factual or whatever by investors or something? But
yeah, same thing happens with humans too. So two thoughts on that. One is, I think this is somewhat fair because of our experience with computers to date. Computers to date have been deterministic. So all of a sudden they're probabilistic and people have expectations that no, computer deterministic, computer always right. But now computer is acting more like human, and human not always right? So that's like something we really have to come to terms with. At the same time, there are mechanisms that you can use to either restrict what it responds with. Like you can see in the Ask Luke example I gave you. If we don't come back with anything in retrieval, we don't respond. So that's one way of mitigating the issue. The other way of mitigating the issue is we go and ask multiple times and then rank and check and then give an answer. So there's things that you can do. Will you ever get to 100%? I guarantee you this is the truth? No. But what percent are you comfortable with? Which sometimes is the same percent that you're comfortable with when you're dealing with humans.
Question from Anthony. How do you contend with slower rollouts where features are rolled out over time to the AI versus all at once?
Where features are slower rolled out to the AI versus all at once. I think that's okay. When we did Ask Luke, first it just worked on web pages, if this is what you're asking. First it just worked on web pages, then we added videos, then we added audio, then we added PDFs, and it all broke because stupid PDFs, and then I had to go back and change it. If you're not in these mission, it depends on what you're in, right? Like in certain domains, per the question we just had, there's a really low tolerance for failure and mistakes. So in that case, maybe it's a different answer. But usually when new technologies are coming out, a good thing to do is to play with them in a more loose way. Maybe if that's internal or what have you, it's great because that's how you learn, right? Since I just said the PDF thing, I wouldn't have known that until we tried it, explored it, and learned.
I have a question about users making that connection between the answer and then knowing the sources. Mm-hmm. Did you find any problems with that, or just showing the visuals did you find was enough? Like
how they find whether or not it actually is a source, you mean?
Yeah, like can they make that connection of like, oh, the answer came from these shown sources?
again, it's probabilistic, so it's a little fuzzy, right? Like, is it exactly citing this exact piece of the document? No. But we know that this document contributed way more to the answer than these other documents. Like, do users exactly get that? Probably not. But they can see, like, oh, these things, and then they read the doc. This is what I've observed. They see these things, they read the document, oh, that's kind of about this. So, and the same thing happens with videos, by the way, right? Like, we're not 100% sure it's exactly at like 1 minute 17. It's like roughly there. So you sort of put them there and you hit play, and it's usually okay.
Thanks for the presentation. Thought it was really great. Jacob Nielsen had an article last summer where he was reflecting on the usability and accessibility issues of conversational interfaces for just in general, but specifically thinking about for these type of models. And he was considering literacy and the literacy that's necessary to be able to effectively interface with this kind of model. You cited a statistic that, where he was concluding that 50% of the population in rich countries will not be able to effectively use these kind of interfaces. Is that something that you're thinking about?
TBD. I heard similar arguments like smartphones are playthings of the rich. And, what is the most empowering tool that you get in a lot of developing countries and rural areas where people are not as technically, don't have the technical opportunities, right? Smartphones like change people's lives in huge ways. So I'm more on the optimistic side with these things. Early on, yeah, they're problematic, right? Computers were hard early on. The web was hard early on. Mobile was hard early on. All these things early on have these types of barriers, but just consistently over the years, I've seen that process play out where the benefits get more broadly adopted and distributed when they can, right? It would be great if we could do it all on day one, but it doesn't necessarily work that way because there's a lot to figure out and improve, and you don't know what to improve and figure out yet. So I'm optimistic. I don't think it'll be in fact, like I can think of a gazillion scenarios where just like talking to the phone is actually a huge accessibility, advancement.
We have a question in the chat from Connie. What is your advice for UX designers who want to learn more and be prepared for the new era with the AI progress, but don't currently have any opportunities to work on AI-related projects?
Yeah, lots of things you can do. So you can go out and literally download AI models on your computer and start using them. There's a cool little service called Pinocchio. If anybody has a Mac, like it removes all the pain of all these various dependencies of models and gives you like one-click install. So you can put a Mac app on your computer and you can go get I wonder if I have this. This joke might not work great for all of you, but whatever, we'll try it. So, let's see if this does it. Oh, is my audio off? It's just.
What?
Oh, sweet.
What?
Oh. All right, give me a second here, people.
Impact of doing all this versus.
Now I'm embarrassing myself, but we'll try it one more time. Okay.
What's happening?
Recognize that guy?
I'm gonna need you to go ahead and come in tomorrow. So if you could be here around 9, that would be great. Okay? Oh, and I almost forgot. I'm also gonna need you to go ahead and come in on Sunday, too, okay? We lost some people this week, and we need to sort of play catch up. Thanks.
Notice anything? I made that on my computer. We're using Pinocchio. It was like, here's a little deepfake AI model called Face Swap, or Face Fusion, I think it was. And you can basically put myself into Office Space. So you could do a heck of a lot, right? Using just your laptop, and you can play and explore and learn all kinds of things about what makes stuff work, what doesn't make things work, etc. All right. Thanks, everybody. I'll hang out, answer questions if anybody wants to come by. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of the event and online. Thank you.